What if the quiet kid you mocked became the only one who could save your family? But what happens when the person you made invisible becomes the one you can't look away from? This is a story about that moment. It's a story about a girl named Maya Liang, and the day she taught a school, a town, and one very popular girl what true strength really looks like. Maya arrived at Harborview High not with a bang, but with the quiet click of a locker door. She was a ghost in a school that thrived on visibility. Her clothes were neat but worn, her backpack heavy with not just textbooks, but with the weight of responsibilities far beyond her 17 years. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were usually fixed on the floor, on a book, on anything but the swirling social currents of the hallway. She had one goal: to get through each day unnoticed, to graduate, and to continue building a life for herself and her aunt, a life cobbled together from late-night shifts and quiet determination. Harborview was a kingdom of glass and sunlight, with sprawling athletic fields and a student parking lot filled with cars that cost more than Maya's aunt's entire convenience store. And every kingdom has its royalty. At Harborview, the throne belonged to Sloane Whitaker. With her effortlessly perfect hair, her entourage, and a smile that could be a weapon or reward, Sloane navigated the halls as if she owned them. And, in a way, she did. Flanking her were Colton Price, football player whose size was his primary form of communication, and Jax Rivera, whose sharp tongue and knowing smirk could dismantle a person's confidence in under 10 seconds. They were a unit, a self-contained ecosystem of power, and they noticed everything. They noticed the new girl who didn't try to impress them. They noticed the way she ate lunch alone, her focus entirely on the pages of a worn paperback. Her refusal to participate in the grand performance of high school was, to them, an act of defiance. And defiance was something they did not tolerate. From the periphery, 2 other sets of eyes were watching. Principal Dr. Kent, a man whose weary expression was etched by years of dealing with teenage drama, saw Maya on his security monitors. He saw a flicker of something different in her, a self-possession that was rare. He also saw the circling sharks. In the hallways themselves, Mr. O'Rourke, the head custodian, saw more than anyone. He saw the subtle shifts in the social tide, the way students would part for Sloane, the fearful glances, the discarded notes. He'd seen girls like Maya before, and he knew how easily they could be swept away by the current. Maya carried secrets within her silence. A worn-out first aid manual was tucked beside her chemistry book, its pages dog-eared and memorized. In the quiet moments before sleep, she didn't dream of parties or popularity. She remembered the scent of tatami mats in a dojo, the feeling of a clean throw, and the voice of her sensei murmuring a single powerful phrase. Mizu no kokoro. A mind like water. It was a philosophy of yielding, of adapting, of letting insults and provocations flow past without disturbance. But even water, when contained and put under enough pressure, can break through stone, and the pressure was beginning to build. The campaign against Maya began as a whisper, a corrosive murmur that followed her through the crowded corridors of Harborview High. It was Sloane's specialty, a form of social warfare fought with insinuation and rumor. "Did you see her shoes? I think my grandmother had a pair like that in 1982. Someone said she works at that grimy little shop by the docks. Probably smells like old bait." The whispers were designed to isolate, to paint Maya as an outsider, a charity case, someone fundamentally less than the polished student body of Harborview. Colton and Jax turned the whispers into minor physical aggressions. A shoulder check in the hall that was just a little too hard. A book, accidentally, swiped from her desk as they passed. They were testing her, prodding her, waiting for the crack in her composure. They were waiting for tears, for an angry outburst, for any sign that their attacks were landing. But Maya gave them nothing. When Colton bumped into her, she absorbed the impact with a dancer's grace, her center of gravity so low and stable that she barely moved. When Jax knocked her book to the floor, she simply bent, picked it up, and placed it back on her desk without a word, her expression unreadable. Inside, a storm was brewing. Each shove, each snide comment was a stone thrown into the placid lake of her mind. She held on to her sensei's words, her father's memory, the solemn promise she had made to herself after winning the Junior National Judo Championship a lifetime ago. She had seen what her skills could do, the fine line between control and harm. She had sworn off fighting, dedicating her discipline instead to the art of healing, poring over her EMT textbooks until the complex terminologies of trauma care became a second language. Her evenings were her sanctuary, a world away from the social battlefield of school. The bell at the end of the day was a release. She would walk the 20 blocks to her aunt's store, the salty air of the harbor washing away the cloying perfume of high school politics. At Liang's Goods, under the fluorescent hum of the beverage coolers, she was no longer the invisible girl. She was Maya. She stocked shelves, ran the register, mopped the floors, and in the quiet lulls between customers she would sit behind the counter, her EMT manual open her mind a million miles away, tracing the pathways of the human circulatory system or memorizing the steps for assessing a patient. This was her reality, the smell of disinfectant, the rhythmic beep of the scanner, the weight of a responsibility that kept her grounded. Meanwhile, the two quiet observers at Harborview were connecting the dots. Mr. O'Rourke, during his nightly sweep, found a crumpled piece of paper near Maya's locker. On it, a crude drawing of a girl with the words "dirty" and "poor" scrawled above it. He smoothed it out, his jaw tightening. It was an old, ugly story, one he'd seen play out too many times. The next morning, he stopped by Dr. Kent's office, the crumpled drawing in his hand. "It's the Whitaker girl and her friends," he said, his voice low. "They're targeting the new transfer, Liang. It's getting worse." Dr. Kent sighed, rubbing his temples. He swiveled in his chair and pulled up the security footage from the previous day's dismissal. He watched as Colton shouldered past Maya. He saw the way she absorbed the blow, her body barely swaying. It wasn't the reaction of a normal student. It was the reaction of someone trained. He zoomed in on her face. There was no fear. There was only a profound, unsettling stillness. "You're right, Frank," the principal said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It is getting worse, and I have a feeling it's about to come to a head." The Harborview High Cafeteria was a microcosm of the school's brutal social architecture. It was a sprawling, echoing chamber where your worth was determined by where you sat. At the center of it all, like a star demanding gravitational obedience, was Sloane Whitaker's table. It was a fortress of popularity, radiating an invisible field that repelled anyone deemed unworthy. All other tables were distant, orbiting satellites, their inhabitants acutely aware of their place in the solar system. Maya Liang always chose a small, two-person table in the far corner, a forgotten peninsula of formica near the clattering dish return. Here, she could become part of the wall, a ghost consuming a meager lunch, her head bowed over a book. Today, it was a thin slice of pizza and an apple, her focus entirely on a chapter about burn classifications in her EMT manual. She was so absorbed, she didn't notice the sudden hush that fell over the room. She didn't see the subtle shift as dozens of students turned their attention toward her corner. She didn't see the phones, held low at first, then rising like periscopes from a sea of tables. The first sign of trouble was a shadow falling over her book. Maya looked up. Sloane, Colton, and Jax stood before her, their expressions a mixture of condescension and predatory amusement. Sloane leaned forward, placing her manicured hands on the table. "Lost? Transfer?" she asked, her voice dripping with mock concern. "This isn't the charity section. You must be confused." A few nervous titters rippled through the nearby tables. Maya said nothing. She simply looked at Sloane, her gaze level, her face a blank canvas. She closed her book and placed it on her tray. This lack of reaction, this quiet dignity, was infuriating to Sloane. She had expected fear, stammering, perhaps even tears. The silence was a challenge. It needed to be broken. Publicly. "You know," Sloane continued, picking up a bowl of steaming tomato soup from her own tray, "you have something on your shirt." She gestured vaguely at Maya's plain gray t-shirt. Maya glanced down. In that split second of distraction, Sloane made her move. With a theatrical gasp of, "Oops!" she pretended to stumble, tipping the entire bowl of hot soup directly onto Maya's lap. The scalding liquid drenched her jeans, her books, her bag. A collective gasp went through the cafeteria, immediately followed by a wave of derisive laughter, amplified for the dozens of phones now openly recording the spectacle. The heat was a shock, a burning insult that seeped through the denim. But the greater pain was the humiliation. Every eye was on her. Every phone was a weapon aimed at her dignity. For a single, agonizing moment, Maya's world narrowed to the sting on her skin and the roar of laughter in her ears. Her hands clenched into fists beneath the table, her knuckles white. The discipline of 1,000 hours in the dojo screamed within her. Mizu no kokoro. A mind like water. She took a deep, shuddering breath, then another. She closed her eyes, shutting out the faces, the phones, the triumphant smirk on Sloane's face. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply absorbed the moment, processed it, and filed it away. Slowly, deliberately, she opened her eyes. She pushed her chair back and stood up, soup dripping from her clothes onto the floor. She didn't look at Sloane. She didn't look at anyone. With a posture as straight and unbroken as a steel rod, she turned and walked out of the cafeteria, leaving a trail of drips and a stunned, uneasy silence in her wake. The laughter had died. Sloane's victory felt strangely incomplete. She had won the battle, but the quiet girl who walked away didn't look defeated. She looked dangerous. Maya stood in the stark, sterile light of the girl's bathroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. The girl looking back was a mess. Her gray t-shirt was stained a dark, angry red. Her jeans were soaked, and a faint smell of tomato clung to her. But her eyes were clear. They held no tears, only a deep, cold reservoir of control. She methodically dabbed at the stains with wet paper towels, the simple, repetitive motion a balm to her frayed nerves. She thought of her promise, the one she'd made to her sensei after her last tournament. He had seen the fire in her, the capacity for destruction that came with her skill. "Your strength, Maya," he had told her, his voice gentle but firm, "is not for breaking others. It is for holding yourself together." She had taken that to heart, channeling her focus from combat to care, from judo to emergency medicine. She would not break that promise. Not for Sloane Whitaker, not for anyone. The rest of the school day was a gauntlet of whispers. "Soup Girl," they called her in hushed tones as she passed. She felt their stares like physical things, but she kept her head high, her gaze fixed forward. She was a rock, and their words were just water, flowing around her. For Sloane and her crew, the day was a triumph. They replayed the videos, basking in the social currency of Maya's humiliation. Yet a nagging unease settled in Sloane. Maya's lack of a reaction was a loose thread in the fabric of her victory. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't even flinched. It felt less like a conquest and more like she had poked something she didn't understand. That feeling curdled into annoyance, then anger. The performance wasn't complete without a final act, a definitive assertion of dominance. As the final bell rang, Sloane pulled Colton and Jax aside. "She thinks she's tough," Sloane said, her voice sharp. "She needs a real lesson, one without an audience." Her eyes glinted. "After school, behind the theater, we're going to teach her some respect." Colton cracked his knuckles, a slow grin spreading across his face. Jax simply nodded, his expression dark. They were her enforcers, and their queen had given an order. Unbeknownst to them, their plan was already being compromised. As Mr. O'Rourke did his rounds that evening, he found the cafeteria table where Maya had been sitting. The floor was still sticky. As he mopped up the last of the tomato soup, his foot nudged something under the table. It was a book, its pages swollen and warped by the liquid. He picked it up. The cover read, Emergency Medical Technician, Principles of Patient Care. He flipped through the ruined pages, seeing complex diagrams of human anatomy and protocols for trauma response. He remembered the crumpled, hateful drawing. He thought of the quiet, hard-working girl he'd seen studying in the library, and then he thought of Sloane Whitaker's casual cruelty. He put the book down, his heart heavy with a grim certainty. He walked straight to Dr. Kent's office and knocked on the open door. "Principal Kent," he said, his voice grave, "I was just cleaning the cafeteria. It wasn't an accident, and I overheard some of Price's friends talking. They're planning something for the Liang girl after school." Dr. Kent's face, already lined with worry, hardened into a mask of grim resolve. He swiveled his chair and pulled up the live security feed for the exterior of the school. He focused on the service alley behind the auditorium. "Thank you, Frank," he said, his eyes glued to the monitor. "Let's see how this plays out." He wasn't just a principal anymore. He was a witness. The area behind the school theater was a concrete no-man's land, a forgotten space littered with overflowing dumpsters and the ghosts of discarded stage props. The late afternoon sun was beginning its descent, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the cracked pavement. It was a place for secrets and confrontations, far from the watchful eyes of teachers and security cameras. This was Maya's usual route home, a shortcut that shaved 10 minutes off her walk. But today, she knew it was not a shortcut. It was a destination. Her senses, honed by years of training, were on high alert. She heard the scuff of a shoe on gravel before she saw them. She felt their presence before they stepped out from behind a large green dumpster. Sloane, Colton, and Jax moved to block her path, arranging themselves in a loose, intimidating triangle. Colton stood in the center, his arms crossed over his massive chest. Jax leaned against the brick wall, a smirk playing on his lips. Sloane stood slightly in front, the architect of this encounter. "Going somewhere, Soup Girl?" Sloane's voice was laced with a venomous sweetness. "We didn't get to finish our conversation earlier." "We're here to teach you some respect," Colton added, his voice a low rumble. He took a step forward, trying to use his size to intimidate her. Maya stopped. She set her heavy backpack down on the ground with a soft thud. She didn't look scared. She looked tired. "I don't want any trouble," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Just let me go home." Jax laughed, a short, ugly sound. "You don't decide when you get to go. We do." He pushed himself off the wall and started to circle her, like a jackal sizing up its prey. The time for words was over. Colton, impatient, made the first move. He lunged forward and grabbed her left arm, his thick fingers digging into her bicep. "You're going to listen to us," he snarled. It was the moment the pressure broke the dam. The instant his hand made contact, Maya's training erupted. It wasn't born of anger, but of pure, instinctual response. Her body moved with an economy and grace that was terrifying to behold. She pivoted on the ball of her right foot, turning into his momentum, not against it. Her free hand came up, not to strike but to guide his elbow. Using his own forward lunge against him, she dropped her center of gravity and turned. The move was an Irami nage, an entering throw. To Colton, it felt like the world had tilted on its axis. One moment he was grabbing her, the next he was airborne, sailing over her shoulder to land flat on his back on the hard concrete. The air rushed out of his lungs with a loud whoosh. He lay there, stunned and gasping, looking up at the sky, completely unable to process what had just happened. He wasn't hurt, but his dominance had been utterly and completely dismantled. Jax, seeing his friend go down, reacted with pure rage. He charged, his right fist swinging wildly for Maya's head. Maya didn't even seem to move. She simply shifted her weight, and his clumsy punch sailed past her ear. As his arm extended, she caught his wrist with both hands. With a small, precise twist, she applied a textbook kote geishi, a wrist turning lock. It wasn't a break, it was a point of unbearable pressure. Jax cried out, a sharp yelp of surprise and pain, and dropped to his knees. Maya released him instantly. He scrambled backward, cradling his wrist, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Sloane was frozen solid. Her enforcers, the twin pillars of her social reign, had been neutralized in less than 5 seconds, and the girl who did it hadn't thrown a single punch. She hadn't kicked. She hadn't even raised her voice. Maya slowly turned to face Sloane, who stood alone and exposed. Maya's expression wasn't triumphant. It was sorrowful. "This is your only warning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried across the alley with the force of a shout. "I do not want to hurt you. I do not want to hurt anyone, but I will protect myself. Leave me alone." She then bent down, picked up her backpack, slung it over her shoulder, and walked away, her footsteps echoing in the sudden, profound silence. She left the 3 of them there, surrounded by the ruins of their power, the social order of Harborview High shattered into a million pieces. That same evening, the town of Harborview was alive. The annual Founders' Day celebration was in full swing on the main pier, a festive explosion of twinkling lights, carnival games, and the smell of popcorn and salt water. Families strolled along the wooden planks, their laughter mixing with the cheerful sounds of a local band playing on a small stage. It was a picture of idyllic community life, a world away from the ugly confrontation behind the theater. Sloane Whitaker was there with her family, trying desperately to pretend that her world hadn't been turned upside down just a few hours earlier. Her father, a respected local councilman, was glad-handing constituents, while her mother chatted with friends. Sloane smiled, she waved, she played the part of the perfect daughter. But underneath the facade, her confidence was a cracked veneer. The image of Maya, so quiet and yet so powerful, was seared into her mind. The effortless way she had dispatched Colton and Jax played on a loop, a terrifying reminder that the power Sloane had cultivated was a fragile illusion. Clinging to her hand was her 8-year-old brother Ezra. He was a whirlwind of energy, his face sticky with cotton candy, his eyes wide with the magic of the fair. "Sloane, can we go on the Ferris wheel? Please," he begged, tugging on her arm. For a moment the mask dropped, and a look of genuine, fierce affection softened her features. "Okay, Ez," she laughed, "but after that, we have to get Dad." In that moment, she wasn't a queen bee or a bully. She was just a big sister who adored her little brother. Not 50 yards away, hidden in the relative anonymity of a food stall, Maya Liang was working. Her aunt's shop had a small booth selling sodas and hot dogs, and Maya was on duty, her movements quick and efficient as she handed out drinks and made change. She wore a simple apron over her clothes, her hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was once again invisible, a background worker fueling the town's celebration. From her vantage point, she could see the crowds, the lights, and, for a fleeting moment, she saw Sloane with her little brother. There was no malice in her gaze, no satisfaction. There was only a quiet observation, a detached acknowledgement of the girl who had made her life a misery. The dramatic irony was thick enough to taste. Sloane knew what Maya was capable of. Maya knew. But to everyone else on that pier, she was just the girl serving sodas. Then chaos erupted. It started with a small commotion near the Ferris wheel line, a child's cry, followed by a woman's scream. Ezra, who had been bouncing with excitement, suddenly stopped. He clutched at his throat, his face rapidly paling to a frightening waxy white. He made a horrible gasping sound, his small body struggling for air, and then he collapsed onto the wooden planks of the pier. Panic spread like wildfire. People backed away, forming a helpless circle. Sloane's parents rushed to their son's side, their faces masks of pure terror. Sloane screamed his name, dropping to her knees beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Ezra! Ezra! What's wrong? Wake up!" But he was unresponsive, his lips turning a terrifying shade of blue. The crowd was a wall of useless spectators, their phones out not to record a humiliation, but a tragedy. Everyone was frozen, paralyzed by shock and fear. No one knew what to do. The happy, festive night had curdled into a nightmare. Through the wall of panicked onlookers, a figure moved with a calm and startling purpose. It was Maya. She had heard the scream, seen the small body fall, and her training had taken over before she even had a conscious thought. She pushed through the crowd, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria with an authority that stunned people into silence. "Let me through. I can help. Everyone give him space." She reached the center of the circle and knelt beside Ezra's still form. She ignored the shocked and terrified faces of Sloane's parents. She even ignored Sloane, who was staring at her as if she were an apparition. Her focus was absolute, narrowed down to the small, fragile life in front of her. "Someone call 911 right now," she commanded to the crowd at large. "Tell them it's a child, approximately 8 years old, unresponsive, with signs of respiratory distress, possible anaphylaxis or a severe asthma attack." Her voice was so confident, so clear, that someone immediately fumbled for their phone and did as she said. Sloane watched, dumbfounded, as the quiet girl she had tormented took complete and utter control of the most terrifying moment of her life. Maya's hands moved with practiced precision, a dance of life-saving assessment she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind and with her textbooks. Airway, breathing, circulation. She tilted Ezra's head back to open his airway and checked for breath. His breathing was shallow, rapid, and accompanied by a high-pitched wheezing sound. His pulse was thready and weak. "Is he allergic to anything?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face, his neck. "Has he been stung? Does he have an inhaler? An EpiPen?" Sloane's mother, jolted from her frozen horror by the direct questions, gasped. "Bees! He's allergic to bees! He was playing by the bushes. He said something stung his hand." She frantically dug through her purse, her hands shaking uncontrollably. "I have his pen. Here." She pulled out the auto-injector and held it out, her eyes pleading. Maya took the EpiPen. She didn't hesitate. She pulled off the safety cap, placed the tip firmly against the side of Ezra's thigh, and pushed. There was a sharp click. She held it in place for a count of 10, her lips moving silently. Then she withdrew it and began massaging the injection site. She carefully repositioned Ezra on his side into the recovery position, ensuring his airway would remain clear if he were to vomit. She kept her fingers on his wrist, monitoring his pulse, her other hand resting gently on his back. "It's okay, Ezra," she murmured, her voice soft and reassuring, a stark contrast to the command she had issued moments before. "Help is on its way. You're being so brave. Just keep breathing." Sloane could only watch, tears streaming silently down her face. It was an overwhelming, humbling collision of two realities. The girl she and her friends had cornered, the girl they called Soup Girl, the girl whose power they had fatally misjudged, was now using that same incredible control, that same steady hand to save her brother's life. The paramedics arrived minutes later, their sirens wailing as they pushed a gurney through the now parted crowd. Maya stood up and gave them a report that was so clear, so professional, it took them by surprise. Male, approximately 8 years old, known allergy to bee stings. Witnessed collapse following a probable sting. Presented with respiratory distress, cyanosis, and a weak pulse. 1 dose of adult epinephrine administered to the lateral thigh approximately 3 minutes ago. Vitals are beginning to stabilize. The lead paramedic looked at her, his expression one of deep respect. "You did good, kid," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You almost certainly saved his life." As they loaded Ezra onto the gurney and rushed him toward the waiting ambulance, Maya simply melted back into the crowd, her work done. She started walking back toward her aunt's stall, but she could feel a pair of eyes on her. It was Sloane, standing frozen on the pier, watching her go, her face a canvas of shame, gratitude, and a profound, life-altering realization. The next day, Harborview High was a tinderbox of rumor and speculation. The story of Ezra Whitaker's collapse on the pier had spread like wildfire, but the details were murky. Some said a doctor in the crowd had saved him. Others whispered it was a heroic stranger. No one connected the dramatic rescue to the quiet, invisible transfer student. But the truth had a way of converging. Dr. Kent, having reviewed the security footage from behind the theater and spoken with a shaken Mr. O'Rourke, had seen enough. He called Sloane Whitaker, Colton Price, and Jax Rivera to his office first thing in the morning. A few minutes later, his secretary summoned Maya Liang. When Maya walked into the principal's office, the tension was so thick it felt like a physical weight. Colton and Jax were slumped in their chairs, staring at the floor, the bravado from the previous day completely gone. Sloane sat ramrod straight, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed. Mr. O'Rourke stood quietly by the door, his presence a silent testament to the full scope of the story. Dr. Kent sat behind his large desk, his expression stern and unyielding. He gestured for Maya to take the empty seat. "I think we all know why we're here," he began, his voice low and serious. "I have security footage of a planned and coordinated act of bullying in the cafeteria yesterday. I have a report from Mr. O'Rourke about overhearing a plan to teach Ms. Liang a lesson. And while there were no cameras behind the theater, I have received multiple anonymous reports describing an assault. An assault in which, by all accounts, the intended victim was the only one who showed any restraint." He steepled his fingers and looked at Sloane, Colton, and Jax. "This behavior is unacceptable. It is grounds for immediate suspension, and, given the premeditated nature of the confrontation, quite possibly expulsion. Before I make my decision, I want to hear the truth. From you." Colton and Jax remained silent, the shame too heavy for words. They risked a glance at Maya, not with anger, but with a new, bewildering respect. They had felt her strength, but they had also felt her mercy. Then Sloane spoke. Her voice was small, fragile, nothing like the confident, cutting tone she usually employed. It was the voice of someone who had been stripped of all her armor. "It's all true," she said, not looking at Dr. Kent but at Maya. "Everything he said. We targeted her. We humiliated her in the cafeteria. We cornered her behind the school." Her voice cracked and she took a shaky breath. "Colton and Jax, they went after her. And she defended herself. She could have really hurt them. But she didn't." The confession hung in the air, raw and devastating. Then Sloane's composure broke completely. She turned fully in her chair to face Maya, and tears began to well in her eyes. "And last night," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion, "my brother, he stopped breathing. Everyone was just standing there, and he was dying." She looked at Maya, her expression one of utter, soul-bearing humility. "You saved him. You ran in, and you saved his life. And I was so horrible to you. I'm so sorry." The room was silent, save for Sloane's quiet sobs. Dr. Kent's stern expression softened. He had been prepared to administer justice, but he was now witnessing a profound act of reckoning. This was more than a simple case of bullying. It was a complex human drama of cruelty, restraint, and unexpected grace. He let the silence sit for a moment before turning his thoughtful gaze to Maya. "Maya," he said gently, "given the circumstances, all of them, I am placing the consequences in your hands. They have earned a severe punishment. What do you think should happen to them?" All eyes in the room swiveled to Maya. The air was thick with anticipation. In her hands lay the power for retribution. With a single word, she could validate Dr. Kent's threat of suspension or expulsion. She could dismantle Sloane's social standing, end Colton's football season, and put a permanent black mark on Jax's record. It would be justice of a kind. It would be the revenge that anyone in her position would be expected to take. She looked at the three of them. She saw Colton, no longer a hulking threat, but a boy whose primary tool had failed him, leaving him confused and ashamed. She saw Jax, whose sharp wit had been silenced, his smirk replaced by a look of genuine remorse. And she saw Sloane, not as a cruel queen bee, but as a terrified older sister, stripped of her pride, her face stained with tears of gratitude and shame. They weren't monsters. They were just kids who had been given too much social power and had no idea how to wield it for anything other than destruction. Revenge would be easy, but it would also be empty. Suspending them won't fix anything, Maya said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight that commanded the room. It won't make this school a safer place. It will just teach them not to get caught next time. It doesn't solve the problem. Dr. Kent leaned forward, intrigued. And what, he asked, do you see as the problem, Maya? Maya took a breath, gathering her thoughts. This was more important than any judo match, more critical than any exam. The problem is fear, she stated simply. Some people here feel powerless. They're afraid of people like Sloane, Colton, and Jax. They don't know how to defend themselves, or how to de-escalate a situation, or even just how to walk away with their heads held high. And some people, she said, glancing at her former tormentors, have power, but they're afraid too, afraid of not being popular, of not being in control, so they use their power to hurt people, because it's the only way they know how to feel strong. She paused, then laid out the idea that had been forming in her mind since the night before. Instead of punishment, she proposed, let's try restorative justice. Let's build something new out of this mess. Her eyes lit up with a passion no one in that room had seen from her before. We can create a program for students, run by students. We can call it the Harborview Night Shift. It's a name for all the kids who feel like they're working overtime just to survive, the ones who walk home alone in the dark, the ones who feel invisible during the day. She had their complete attention. I can teach things, she continued, her confidence growing. I can teach basic self-defense. Not how to fight, but how to escape a bad situation, how to break a wrist grab, how to use someone's momentum against them so you can get away, how to have the confidence to just walk away. She looked at the ruined EMT book that Mr. O'Rourke had placed on Dr. Kent's desk. And I can teach what I taught myself. Basic first aid, how to do CPR, how to use an EpiPen, what to do when someone is choking or bleeding, how to be useful in a crisis instead of just being a bystander. Then came the most radical part of her proposal. She looked directly at Sloane, Colton, and Jax. And they can help me run it, she said. They're the most popular kids in this school. They have influence. People listen to them. They can use that influence to make it cool to be prepared. They can organize it, promote it, get people to show up. They can use their power to protect people instead of hurting them. Dr. Kent stared at her, utterly speechless for a moment. Then a slow, deep smile of admiration spread across his face. This was more than he could have ever hoped for. It was leadership. It was wisdom. It was true strength. Mr. O'Rourke, still standing by the door, gave a slow, deliberate nod of profound approval. Sloane looked up at Maya, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, overwhelming sense of grace. She had been offered not a punishment, but a purpose, a chance at redemption. "I'll do it," she choked out, her voice thick with unshed tears. "We'll do it. Thank you." It wasn't an apology anymore. It was a promise. The first session of the Harborview Night Shift was held 2 weeks later in the school's cavernous gymnasium. The atmosphere was a strange cocktail of curiosity, awkwardness, and nervous energy. Students milled around the edges of the big, blue wrestling mats, unsure of what to expect. This wasn't a football game or a pep rally. It was something entirely new. What made it truly surreal was who was running the check-in table. Sloane Whitaker, Colton Price, and Jax Rivera stood behind a folding table, handing out bottles of water and information flyers. There was no trace of their old arrogance. Colton, instead of intimidating freshmen, was showing them where to put their bags. Jax, whose words had once been weapons, was now using them to offer genuine encouragement. "Hey, glad you could make it. It's going to be good." Sloane was the most transformed. She moved with a quiet humility, her focus on making everyone feel welcome. She was using her considerable organizational skills and social capital not for exclusion, but for radical inclusion. When a group of nervous-looking ninth graders hesitated by the door, she walked over, a warm, genuine smile on her face. "Come on in," she said. "You're in the right place." Then Maya walked to the center of the mat. A hush fell over the gym. She was no longer the invisible girl, the ghost in the hallway. Dressed in a simple t-shirt and athletic pants, she stood with a quiet confidence that radiated throughout the room. She was a leader. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "Thanks for coming. What we're going to learn here isn't about fighting. It's about not having to. It's about having the tools to feel safe and the skills to help others feel safe too." She started with something simple. How to break a wrist grab. She demonstrated on Colton, who volunteered with a surprising eagerness. Her movements were fluid, precise, and educational. She broke down the technique, explaining the principles of leverage and joint manipulation. Then she had the students pair up and practice. She walked through the crowd, correcting postures, offering gentle guidance. She stopped by a freshman who was struggling, her movements timid. "Don't be afraid to be firm," Maya said softly. "Your safety is worth it." Later in the session, they moved to the first aid portion. CPR dummies were laid out in neat rows. Sloane knelt beside one, her brow furrowed in intense concentration as Maya explained the rhythm of compressions and rescue breaths. The girl who had once orchestrated public humiliation was now diligently practicing the steps to save a life. At one point, Maya knelt down to adjust Sloane's hand position. "Like this," she said gently. "Use your body weight." Their eyes met, and for the first time a small, genuine smile passed between them. It was a smile of mutual respect, of a shared purpose born from the ashes of a painful conflict. The Harborview Night Shift became the new heart of the school. The initial awkwardness gave way to a powerful sense of community. The old cliques began to dissolve as football players learned first aid alongside drama club members, and student council leaders practiced de-escalation techniques with kids from the fringes. The culture of the school began a slow, seismic shift, away from fear and hierarchy and toward mutual support and shared responsibility. Dr. Kent secured permanent funding for the program, making it a fixture of the Harborview curriculum. Mr. O'Rourke would often pause his nightly rounds, leaning against the gymnasium doorway, and watch the sessions with a proud, quiet smile. One evening, as the program wrapped up, Maya packed her bag. As she walked out into the cool night air, she wasn't alone. Sloane, Jax, and a few other students from the program fell into step beside her. The silence wasn't heavy or awkward. It was comfortable, filled with the easy camaraderie of people who had worked together and built something meaningful. They talked about school, about the program, about their plans for the weekend. Maya Liang was no longer Soup Girl or the invisible transfer. She was Maya, a teacher, a hero, a friend. Maya learned a long time ago that true strength isn't about how hard you can hit, but how much you can restrain. She faced cruelty and chose compassion. She was offered revenge and chose protection instead. Her actions didn't just save one life that night on the pier. They transformed an entire community, proving that the most powerful form of victory isn't defeating your enemies, but winning them over. The quietest person in the room is often the one with the most to teach us, if only we take the time to listen. Their silence isn't emptiness. It's strength, waiting for the right moment to change the world. So share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that real power lies not in tearing others down, but in having the strength and the skill to build them up, especially when they least deserve it. Comment below with a time someone showed you unexpected kindness. And let's remember that the best revenge is to protect, to heal, and to become the person they never thought you could be.